J.M. Another story from the memory of Sherlock Holmes. Prologue. The man was simply known as Professor. No one referred to him by his name. It was as if calling him by his name was somehow taboo. It stemmed from a certain sense of respect, if you could call awe and disgust respect. Yes, everyone who knew him feared him. I was one of them. Despite harboring a deep-seated resentment towards him as the supposed enemy of my parents, I couldn't help but feel a strange admiration. He said, "Come with me. Your father was an admirable man, but he wasn't as exceptional as you are. The superior survive. That's the order of this world." He favored words like order and logic. I followed his logic. I wasn't entirely convinced, but acceptance was my only choice. People love those with power. I knelt before the authority and power he possessed, forsaking love for my parents and pride in my family. He was an incredibly powerful individual. However, violence was not to his liking. As the title Professor suggested, he was an intellectual and calm person. Nevertheless, he understood the enormity of his own power. Behind the clever mask, he harbored ambitions. Ambitions for something colossal and unprecedented. The stage for these ambitions was the world. To make the entire world kneel before him. Such an unimaginable daydream was progressing methodically and steadily in his mind. Even when opposed by the world, his intelligence and logic remained unshaken. That was his charm. Overwhelmed by the scale of his aspirations, people bowed before him. The emotion people felt in his presence was fear. Though he refrained from using violence, he excelled at manipulating the subtleties of people's emotions, evoking fear. He ruled people through fear. Chapter 1. A Woman with Blue Eyes. The summer came to an end, and as the soft breeze swept through, the scent of autumn began to linger. I had returned to the boarding school in Sheffield from my family home in Nottingham. Gazing out of the dormitory window at the lawn-covered schoolyard and the forest beyond, which was starting to turn red, I found myself reflecting on the uneventful summer that had just passed. I was an ordinary student. While the Garrett family of Nottingham was well known locally, at Hamilton Boarding School, where children of nobility from across the UK gathered, I was a relatively insignificant presence. As I pondered how to spend the last day of summer vacation before the new term began, I had no inclination to join the group of friends chattering in the common room. I was somewhat shy, and even with close acquaintances, I couldn't help feeling a bit awkward when meeting them after a long absence. The topics of their conversation were always the same, inevitably centered around girls and the mischief they got up to during the break. There was no need for me to hurry down to the common room. I had plenty of time to settle into school life. I was lost in contemplation when a knock on the door echoed. "Come in." As I called out, the face of the school secretary, Everton, appeared through the door's crack. "Hey, Marcus. You in here?" Everton, with his round glasses perched on his tousled head, entered the room, revealing a friendly demeanor. "Can I help you with something?" I asked somewhat reservedly, not wanting to be disturbed. "The headmaster wants to see you." "The headmaster? Why?" "I have no idea. You should go and find out. He wants you there right away." As I rose from the chair by the window, Everton followed, and we left the room. We crossed the lawn outside the dormitory, heading towards the academic building where the headmaster's office was located. The headmaster's office was more luxurious compared to other rooms. Mahogany panels covered the walls, and the floor was adorned with a thick carpet that muffled our footsteps. As Everton ushered me in, the headmaster and a young woman standing next to him rose from the central sofa. "Mr. Garrett, how was your summer?" Pointing to the sofa opposite his, the headmaster said, "Let me introduce Miss Fulbright." Upon the headmaster's introduction, I directed my attention to the woman standing beside him. A striking beauty. Her face, with a straight nose and tightly drawn lips, held an alluring charm that could captivate a man without effort. Above all, what left the most impression were her translucent blue eyes and flowing, pale golden hair. However, even when she smiled, those eyes carried a hint of melancholy. We exchanged greetings only after she extended her hand. I was so entranced that I had forgotten even to introduce myself. "Nice to meet you." I shook her hand clumsily. I was completely absorbed in her captivating presence. "Today, we've gathered here to talk about your future," the headmaster said. "My future? Now that you're entering your final year at our school, you must have thought about your plans after graduation. Perhaps you've already discussed the matter with your family? Miss Fulbright has a proposal regarding your future. It's a very generous offer. Listen attentively." The headmaster's words seemed to be subtly guiding me. "Sir, I'd like to speak with him by ourselves," Miss Fulbright hesitantly mentioned, and the headmaster, somewhat timidly, got up and left the room. His deferential attitude hinted at some prior arrangement. "Today, I came here on behalf of a professor." Once we were alone, Miss Fulbright leaned forward and began. "I work as the professor's personal secretary at Oxford." "The professor of Oxford? What could a high school student like me have to do with a university professor?" "Yes. The professor is currently looking for a capable assistant." "Assistant?" I still couldn't grasp the purpose of her visit. There were plenty of capable candidates to be assistants to a university professor. "Well, the professor is willing to establish a position for you at the university if you're interested." "Establish a position for me? But I haven't even graduated from high school yet. How can I consider becoming a university professor's assistant?" "No, the professor wants to personally nurture an assistant. How about it? Do you have any interest in trying?" Her tone was challenging. Unable to back down after such a provocation, I agreed, intrigued by the prospect of going to Oxford. Although her proposal was mysterious, going to university held significant allure. Besides, I wanted to know the reasons behind the professor's interest in me. Chapter 2. The Professor. "Do you believe in God?" That was the professor's first question. The room was the professor's study, facing the stone-paved courtyard. It had more of the atmosphere of a private study than a laboratory at Oxford. Bookshelves lined the walls on both sides, and the front and back of the room were further divided by bookshelves. Each shelf was filled with books from end to end. Miss Fulbright led me into the room and introduced me to the middle-aged man. After bluntly ushering her out and closing the door, the professor looked at me with an appraising gaze. He must have been way over 50, but his tall, supple body and sharp gaze exuded the vigor of a man in the prime of life. If there was anything professor-like about him, it was the long, extended eyebrows and the intellectual gaze deep in his eye sockets. After scrutinizing me with impolite eyes, the professor snorted and threw out the question above. I was taken aback by his impoliteness. It is inadequate to start a conversation with such words, especially when you speak with a person whom you haven't met before. What's the matter? Can't you speak, or is it that your mouth won't open? The professor urged me for an answer. Yes, I do. I was raised in a Christian household, I replied, feeling uneasy. Humph. A Christian, the professor snorted. Most people living in this country are. Now, let me ask you. Does your God save you? Do you think he saves everyone who believes in him? Well. I stumbled in my response. Is this part of the interview? It shouldn't be about my faith, but rather a test of how I would answer. You were born into a noble family, raised without any hardships. On the other hand, in this country, there are many people living on the verge, not knowing if they'll make it through today, let alone tomorrow. Do you think your God is the same as theirs? The God of Christianity is one. I said, my body tensing slightly. It is rather easy for someone who has a comfortable and affluent life to believe in God. You probably think you are loved by God, don't you? On the other hand, do you think those who live on the edge, not knowing about tomorrow, believe in the same God as you? What are you trying to say? I resented despite myself and confronted the professor. Isn't it taboo to cast doubt on someone's faith? The meaning of the existence of God changes depending on the person's position and perspective. There are various gods in the world. Without paying attention to my changing color, the professor continued. God is not alone, you mean? I asked. Take Christianity as an example. Even if they are based on the Roman Catholic Church, many sects have been born and object to its way. The Church of England, for example, was created for the convenience of the king. Even if the sects are different, God is still God. I protested. However, depending on the observer, God shows different faces. If God is an absolute existence, could such a thing happen? Aren't you a Christian? I challenged. It was a genuine question. Being a Christian was a prerequisite for me, an Englishman. It was hard to believe that my fellow countrymen could be a pagan. I'm saying that God cannot be alone. God's nature changes depending on the person's position and perspective. Do you deny God? I felt my heart harden. The professor paced back and forth on the floor of his study, the sound of his footsteps echoing softly. Man is a creature who sees only what he wants to see. He cannot face the reality before him. He averts his eyes from sadness and hardship, unwilling to confront them. What he sees is merely a convenient deity who forgives his sins, one tailored to his own desires. Could it be that God is nothing more than an illusion crafted for human convenience? Would you not agree? I remained silent, grappling for words of rebuttal. Let me make it clear. The professor continued, pointing his index finger at me. I am not an atheist. After driving this point home to me, the professor's demeanor softened slightly. Let us pose a different question. Do you believe there is a God in the world of monkeys? Do monkeys believe in a God? At the mention of monkeys, something clicked in my mind. Ah, Darwin's theory of evolution, I responded. Having heard of the controversial theory that had stirred up much debate recently, I felt adequately informed. It was a challenge against the Christian world posed by a single scientist. Very astute, the professor nodded approvingly, clapping his hands lightly. The argument that humans are descendants of monkeys seems to make sense, except that it is unacceptable. I said with blatant sarcasm. Any theory sounds strange at first. Let us delve into this discussion a bit further, shall we? With a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the professor continued. Are humans akin to monkeys then? In essence, are humans merely slightly smarter monkeys? If Darwin is correct, the answer would be yes. Yet, you find it hard to accept. Why is that? It is because humans are different from monkeys, I replied. That answer won't suffice. I wish to know the reason behind it, the professor pressed on. As I fell silent, the professor narrowed his eyes. Humans possess God, while monkeys do not. That is the decisive difference between humans and monkeys. So, the professor is not a devotee of Darwin after all. Then, what does it mean to possess God? Giving me time to ponder on the matter, the professor fell silent for a moment, and then resumed his argument. So, what is God then? Is God merely a product of human imagination? If so, is it not the human imagination that truly defines humanity? You seem to assume that there is no God, I pointed out. Earlier, the professor stated he was not an atheist. And if he isn't a follower of Darwin either, he doesn't seem to deny the existence of God. But does he have substantial evidence to refute the theory of evolution? Well, let us proceed step by step, the professor said calmly, as if giving a lecture to an impatient pupil. The issue lies in the power of imagination. This is an ability unique to humans. Then, tell me, what kind of God do you imagine or envision? Imagining God. Doesn't that mean that humans create God? Though curious about the professor's line of reasoning, I grew apprehensive about continuing the conversation. Is discussing God itself not a form of disrespect towards God? The Lord, the Almighty God, in the end, shall save those who believe him. He forgives those who repent, I replied. Yes, that's what we're taught in Sunday school. So, is your God a benevolent one? The professor inquired. God sent his only Son, Jesus, to deliver his teachings, which spread righteousness throughout the world, I answered. Thus, God is a benevolent being, the professor reiterated. I nodded. However, according to the Bible, God is said to have created humans in his own image. If God is perfectly good, why aren't humans? Evil exists in the hearts of humans, which is an undeniable fact. Perhaps God shaped them in his physical likeness, not in his hearts, I suggested. Setting aside whether God has a physical form, if God is a perfect being, why does he allow the existence of evil in the first place? The professor questioned. The Bible mentions the fallen angel. The moment I uttered those words, the professor snapped his fingers as if he had reached a point of revelation. Our thoughts were now aligning. He was reduced to a being called Satan, the serpent who tempted Adam and Eve, the first humans. I couldn't help but continue, already familiar with the tale as common knowledge. The Bible portrays this serpent as the root of all evil. But where did this serpent come from? Although it's said to be Satan's incarnation, Satan himself was originally an inhabitant of heaven. Lucifer, the archangel, I murmured. When was he branded as fallen angel in heaven's radiant realm? Why was Lucifer expelled from heaven? The professor said in a low voice, as if sinking into reflection. Was there room for evil to enter in heaven? I questioned. Our thoughts now mirrored each other's entirely. It was a terrifying realization. Am I trying to uncover knowledge that should remain hidden? There's another symbolic story. The professor went on, paying no heed to my question. The fruit of knowledge that Adam and Eve consumed made them aware of their nakedness. It was the moment when humans acquired the same wisdom as God. The fruit of knowledge is also known as the forbidden fruit, and eating it is considered humanity's original sin. As a consequence of Eve succumbing to the serpent's temptation, women have since had to endure the pain of childbearing. It's a well-crafted tale. The professor concluded with a chuckle. The accounts in the Bible are sacred. They're not mere fairy tales, I interjected, unable to fully condone the professor's casual attitude towards God. In some respects, they are similar. Both must have had a factual basis. The professor evaded my reproachment. Leaving that aside, why is obtaining knowledge considered a sin? Why did Lucifer, the fallen angel, turn to evil? The professor asked. Seeing where the conversation was heading, I stared at the professor dumbfoundedly, unable to voice the answer. My lips trembled so terribly I couldn't articulate it. Observing my reaction, the professor smiled contentedly. God fashioned humans and angels in his image. If humans and angels can succumb to evil, then perhaps God. No, that's a lie, I interrupted. It's a conclusion drawn from logical reasoning. The professor dismissed my rebuttal and continued. Considering this, it explains the injustices in the world. God must encompass both good and evil, cosmos and chaos. To perceive God as solely good is merely wishful thinking. It's an overly convenient notion. Yet, that is the very thing that defines humanity. Animals other than humans cannot create gods. That's the decisive difference between animals and humans. Humans are definitely not monkeys. That fact proves the existence of God. And God, like humans, harbors both light and darkness within his heart. That's the truth. That's not the God taught in Christianity, I retorted. He's not the God you desire, that's all, the professor stated, leaving me speechless. With a faint smirk on his lips, the professor looked at me triumphantly. This was my first encounter with the professor. I decided I would never meet such a blasphemous man again. However, a month later, Cheryl Fulbright appeared at Hamilton's dormitory once more, and I found myself accepting the professor's invitation. Like a sailor drawn to the siren's song.